In my career as a horror filmmaker, I've made many friends among fellow directors, actors, and aspiring amateurs. I often keep in touch with them through Facebook, where we'll chat about the challenges we face in trying to make independent films. For me, working in horror is a way of exploring supernatural belief and possibilities, and while I could never claim to be an absolute believer, one indie film-making friend of mine, Christopher, most certainly was. And how that belief became an obsession is something for which I feel deeply responsible. The most popular of my films featured a character called the Owlman, a godlike monster that could grant wishes to those willing to murder the ones they love. It resembled a tall man, dressed in a dark Victorian tall suit, with long razor-sharp claws and a giant owl's head with round bulbous eyes. It spoke with a wisdom that was both ancient and terrible, and was a millennia-old master manipulator, inspired by an ancient god known as Moloch. Late into the night, Christopher and I would talk about the limitless possibilities of the universe, of what entities or godlike beings might exist out there, somewhere. Christopher was adamant that he didn't believe in God, but that he might believe in the gods. Apart from our shared interests, I really knew nothing at all of Christopher's personal life, except that, like me, he was from the United Kingdom. His Facebook profile showed no photographs of himself, no pictures of friends or family, and displayed no location. I assumed he was a loner, perhaps eccentric, but otherwise harmless. Most of all, he was a huge fan of the Owlman, and of our prank videos especially. The Owlman prank videos were produced to promote our movies, and we would spend weeks planning and executing these pranks on an unwary public. Our favorite location for filming was a centuries-old fever hospital for children. It had been abandoned for decades, and was located in a wasteland some miles out of town. As the months went by, the topic of conversation shifted from the limitless possibilities of the universe to the Owlman. Christopher only wanted to chat about what had inspired us to create him, when the next video would be produced, even if he could meet him. Eventually, his correspondence became relentless, and sadly, in the end, I was forced to ignore his messages. This agitated him, but after a while, the messages stopped, and for a couple of months, there was no contact at all, until one night, when he sent a single image that chilled my blood. Taken at night, the image was difficult to discern, but I could tell that the background, at least, was the children's hospital. In the center of the image was someone standing some distance away, facing straight towards the camera. The figure was wearing a hood which covered their face. There appeared to be something scrawled on it, 3 letters, but I couldn't make out what they were. I don't think I wanted to make it out, as the image was deeply unsettling. Why had Christopher sent me this, and how had he discovered the locations of our pranks, so close to where I lived? I lived with my partner in a small house by the forest, just out of town. Beautiful, but remote. Getting up from the computer, I moved cautiously from room to room to check that the windows were latched shut, and finally my front door, which thank God was locked. As I returned to the computer, I fetched a kitchen knife and kept it by my desk. Loading up the image in Photoshop, I decided to investigate the strange letters I had seen on the figure's hood. First, I adjusted the brightness, revealing little. Then I increased the contrast, which helped, but the letters were still unclear. Finally, I added a sharpening effect and the letters emerged from the darkness. The first was M, followed by L, then K. That sequence of letters, M, L, K, had a terrible significance for me, as I knew from my research into the Owlman character that those letters were an ancient reference to Moloch. Often scrawled across the walls of temples and forbidden ruins, The cursed religion of Moloch identified itself by the letters MLK. Did Christopher believe that the Owlman was real? My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Part of me wanted to reply to his message, to draw some comfort that perhaps this was all a practical joke made in poor taste. A horrific realization dawned on me as I noticed that Christopher and I suddenly shared a new mutual friend, my partner Sarah. Had he messaged her as well? It was 10:35 p.m. She was out with friends and would probably not be back until late. I sent her a message to warn her of the strange image that I had received and urged her to return home. As the seconds passed without reply, my mouth became dry. Then, to my relief, I could see the ... icons in our chat window, signaling her imminent reply. Another picture? My stomach turned. It was a photograph of a red Toyota, parked by the side of a road long since surrendered to the undergrowth. Sarah's car. Behind it was a towering structure, the main building of the abandoned children's hospital. I sent her many more desperate messages, but no reply came. Never have I felt such despair and helplessness as I did at that moment. Christopher must have tricked her into meeting him, and now she was trapped there, in the dark, with this psychopath. I replied to Christopher's first message. Please don't hurt Sarah. Just tell me what you want. As I waited, my mind raced with mad, anxious plans. Should I call my friends and go with them to try and rescue her? Or surely I should call the police. But what if he murdered her before help arrived? What if I couldn't save her? What if she was already dead? I rushed to the kitchen and gagged over the sink, vomiting in pathetic terror at the situation I found myself in. When I staggered back to my computer, I saw that Christopher had replied, I want you to believe. More ... appeared. Come alone. I shall show you the proof of God. I was afraid, but also determined to save her. While I waited for the taxi, I put on a long black coat and concealed a kitchen knife in one of the pockets. Christopher might be watching from a hiding spot at the hospital, which consisted of a whole complex of crumbling brick buildings, and Sarah could be in any of them. Headlights swept through the blinds of my bedroom as the taxi rumbled to a stop outside. It was time to go. Facing whatever horrors lay ahead, I stepped out into the wintry night. The icy wind was so cold that my own breath swirled like smoke. I said nothing to the driver, despite his best efforts to initiate conversation, and soon we arrived at the desolate outskirts of town. I would walk the rest of the way on foot, down a pitch-black track of abandoned road, towards whatever fate had in store for me. The freezing wind blasted my face, blowing away my tears of rage and frustration. I passed Sarah's car by the side of the road. It laid empty, its doors unlocked. There was no sign of a struggle, at least as far as I could tell. About 100 feet ahead of me, looming over a horizon of overgrown forest, was the crooked assembly of hospital ruins, each building more foreboding than the next. Before them stood an imposing iron gate, the view beyond it obscured by a twisted jungle of weeds. The moon provided little help, silhouetting instead of illuminating the buildings ahead, which, over the treetops, resembled a sort of infernal Mount Rushmore of monstrous heads. My cell phone showed no new messages, and as I made my way into the center of the complex, I could see no sign of life. It was deathly quiet. The only sound, the wind whistling through broken windows. I switched on my phone's torch, guiding it to the surrounding buildings. Most of them were single-story, brick-built sheds, their roofs sagging inwards, ready to collapse at any second. I aimed the beam of light at the windows and doorways, desperately seeking some sign that Sarah was here, and that she was all right. My phone flashed. A message. It was from Christopher. Turn off your torch. I did as instructed, and looked all around me, exposed and fully vulnerable. If he were intent on killing me, he could come from any direction. Then, all would be lost. A lump formed in my throat as I slid my hand into my coat, gripping the kitchen knife in preparation for whatever might come next. Of all the buildings, there was one that stood out from the rest. It wasn't the largest, but it was the most remarkable. It resembled a church, with a stone tower and adjoining hall. I couldn't help but sense that Christopher might be hiding in there, in the most grandiose of the ruins, and the most suitable venue for his supposed proof of God. Stone steps led to a collapsed door, and beyond it, a great hall. Once a ward, no doubt, to countless sick children, decades, even centuries ago. Shafts of moonlight streamed through the broken windows, illuminating slivers of debris, collapsing floorboards, and a white feather. A white feather. In my original film featuring the Owlman, the protagonist would discover feathers, serving as clues, or deadly reminders that it was coming. Everything in the place was covered in soot and dust from the fire that had doomed the building to decay. Everything except for the feather, that is. I picked it up and called out to Christopher. "Christopher, I've followed your clues. I've done what you've asked." Moments later, a message flashed on my phone. "Look up." I looked up immediately, but could see nothing but the moonlight piercing through the holes in the broken roof. I switched on my phone and torch once again, and shone it around the hall, but nothing stood out to me. I was about to reply to Christopher when the torchlight landed on a small doorway that I had missed before. I approached it and observed a set of stairs leading upwards, probably towards the attic. The narrow stairwell had plastered walls, black with rotten decay. The ascent was claustrophobic, the rotten wood under my feet making each step more perilous than the last, all leading towards a single closed door awaiting me at the very top. A green door, brass handle, and another single feather. Another message from Christopher. "Open the door and meet your God." I had reached the summit of my horror. I looked back and winced at the sight of the staircase I'd climbed, vanishing into darkness. This was it. I took out the kitchen knife and grasped it tightly, ready to strike if I had to. Thoughts of Sarah flashed before me. Please, God, I thought. Just let her be safe. Take me if you have to. It was like watching someone else as my hand twisted the brass handle of the green door, as it creaked and cracked, opening slowly. Beyond the door was total and utter blackness. I was effectively blind. I fumbled again for my phone and shone my torch into the darkness. And then I saw God. The Owlman. The Owlman. Shrieking in horror, I stepped back, tripping on the warped wooden floor. I found myself tumbling backwards down the steps of the narrow staircase. As I landed at the bottom of the stairs, a chunk of jagged debris pierced my arm, slashing through the skin. Having dropped my phone, I could see little in the darkness. My mind raced with panic and fury. I could barely take my eyes away from the black void at the top of the stairs, waiting, wondering with horror whether the Owlman might come for me. I shouted in rage and terror. I heard footsteps, not from the top of the stairs, but from the main hall below. Without thinking, I dragged myself up. My left arm was soaked in blood and felt like it was broken. Nevertheless, I charged into the main hall, and there I saw Christopher running out the door into the night. I still had the kitchen knife. I charged after him into the courtyard, shouting and swinging the blade, but he was gone. I could see no sign of him, nothing except an abandoned cloak that he must have thrown to the ground as he ran, the hood emblazoned with MLK. In the minutes that passed, the injury I suffered began to affect me, slowing me down, blurring my vision. Thoughts of Sarah raced through my mind, and I called out to her amongst the ruins, while fighting to remain conscious. Returning to the main building, I staggered back into the great hall. To my shock, I saw the Owlman shuffling in the dark, but this Owlman looked different, not like the startling vision I saw at the top of the stairs. By some instinct, I approached it. This was a costume, much like the type I used in our prank videos. I removed the head gently, and there, inside, was Sarah, her mouth taped shut. Once I untied her, she helped me back to the car, explaining how she too had been lured there, and then forced by a masked stranger to adorn a costume he had constructed. As she drove me to the hospital, I asked her how she had managed to get down the collapsed set of stairs. She looked at me strangely, a look that I will never forget, and said, "I was on the ground floor the whole time." By the time I had returned home, Christopher had deleted what little remained of his internet presence. I never saw or heard from him again, but neither me nor Sarah will ever forget the horror of what we experienced that night, and I still live in fear for the day that I might encounter a white feather, or a question of sanity of the likes that was presented to me that night by the Owlman.